You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the 1930's Dust Bowl. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's Dusty episode.
The 1930's Dust Bowl was the result of a period of severe dust storms that greatly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies. The phenomenon itself was caused by a combination of natural factors, like the severe drought, and a combination of human-made factors and bad decisions, which included a failure to apply dryland farming methods to prevent wind erosion, which notably destroyed all the natural topsoil of the area, which was carried out by the settlers in the region. The drought actually came in three waves: 1934, 1936 and 1939 to 1940. However, some regions of the high plains experienced drought conditions for at least 8 years with little to no respite. The drought and erosion of the 1930's Dust Bowl affected 100 million acres, that's 400,000 square miles of land, that centred on the Texas Panhandle along with the Oklahoma Panhandle, and even touched adjacent sections of New Mexico, Colorado and Kansas. The 1930's Dust Bowl forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families who were by now unable to pay their mortgages or grow crops on their land to abandon their farms, with total losses by 1936 reaching a whopping $25 million per day, which is the equivalent to $550 million per day in 2023. Many of these families, who were given the nickname of Okies because many of them came from Oklahoma, migrated to California and other states, only to find that the Great Depression had rendered the economic conditions there only barely a little better than those they had left behind. The Dust Bowl caused a multitude of health problems for individuals in the area, which included dust pneumonia, coughing spasms, silicosis from breathing, and an exposure to noxious mix of fungi. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this Mr. Pledge episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a psychic medium, a ufologist and a true crime buff. And just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every Monday night, though occasionally on a Tuesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, and the many missing people that often go unnoticed. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other many podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the disastrous stories surrounding the 1930's Dust Bowl. And this week's necessary disclaimer: well, this story is a tale that sadly involves families suffering from illness and destitution, so may prove upsetting to some. Oh, also, we also go into some abuse details at the end when introducing next week's show, so just to give you fair warning. As usual, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, is just like the weather. Yes, I mean it can be a little unpredictable at times, or shall we say, more often than not. Anyway, let us get back to the story. So, first thing we must ask ourselves is, what is a dust bowl? Well, a dust bowl, which is probably better known as a dust storm or sandstorm, depending on its location, is a meteorological phenomena that is common in both arid and semi-arid regions. Dust storms arise when a gust front or other strong winds blow any loose sand and dirt from a dry surface, with the fine particles of this dust then being transported by a method known to geologists as saltation and suspension, which is a process that moves soil or sand from one place and deposits it in another. The principal areas of terrestrial sources of this airborne dust are the arid regions of North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia and China. The term sandstorm itself is used most often in the context of a desert dust storm, especially in places like the Sahara Desert, or places where sand is a more prevalent soil type rather than dirt or rock. And when fine particles of dust obscure visibility, a considerable amount of larger sand particles are blown closer to the surface. The name dust storm is more than likely to be used when finer particles are blown across long distances, especially when the dust storm affects urban areas, but today it usually refers to the Dust Bowl event, along with the other term Dirty 30's. These dust storms are also quite common in the Canary Islands, with the sand and dust being blown westwards across the sea from Morocco. It has been argued, although according to Wikipedia this comes from an unreliable source, that poor management of the Earth's drylands, such as neglecting the fallow system of working, which is a farming technique in which arable land is left without sowing for one or more cycles, is increasingly the size and frequency of dust storms from desert margins and changing both the local and global climate, as well as impacting many local economies. The Dust Bowl area, otherwise known as the Great Plains, lies principally west of the prime meridian line of Greenwich, on the high plains in western United States. The area itself is semi-arid, receiving less than 20 inches or 510 millimetres of rain annually, with this rainfall supporting the shortgrass prairie biome originally present in the area. In a short interesting side note here, biomes are areas of the planet with similar climates, landscapes, animals and plants, with the animals in the biome depending on the plants for food and the plants in the biome depending on the animals to spread their pollen and seeds so new plants can grow. Therefore, both the plants and animals rely on each other to survive and flourish. The Dust Bowl region is also prone to extended drought periods, alternating with unusual wetness intervals of equivalent duration. During the wet years, the rich soil of the area provides bountiful agricultural output, but during dry years, the crop will fail, with the region also being subjected to very high winds. During the early European and American exploration of the Great Plains, this region was thought to be pretty unsuitable for any European-style agriculture, which explorers naming the area the Great American Desert, and with its lack of any surface water or timber, making the region less attractive than other areas for pioneer settlements and agriculture. The federal government, however, encouraged the settlement and development of the Great Plains for agriculture via the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered settlers a quarter section, meaning 160-acre plots, to work on. And so, with the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, waves of both new migrants and immigrants reached the Great Plains and thus greatly increased the acreage under new cultivation. Recognising the challenges of cultivating marginal arid land, the US government then expanded on the 160 acres originally offered under the Homestead Act of 1862 and granted a further 640 acres to homesteaders in western Nebraska and an extra 320 acres elsewhere, making it over 1,120 acres in total. This, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, resulted in waves of European settlers arriving at the Great Plains. And with the return of the unusually wet weather for the area, seemingly confirming a previously held opinion that the formerly semi-arid area could support large-scale agriculture, which meant that everything was coming up roses for the landowners. I, of course, mean that the settlers' futures look good. Not that they planted any roses, of course. Well, they might have done outside the homestead. Never mind. Anyway, another advantage to help fatten the farmers' wallets and feed their families was that with the technological improvements changing all the time, such as mechanised ploughing and harvesting, it made it possible to operate larger properties without the need for additional staff, thus decreasing the cost of labour. After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at some of the corners cut by the farmers that may have contributed to the Dust Bowl phenomena and how it travelled to other parts of the United States.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could and has taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers, And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
After the fairly favourable climatic conditions back in the 1920s, along with a good rainfall and relatively moderate winters which permitted increased settlement and cultivation in the Great Plains, during the summer of 1930, the Great Plains region then unexpectedly entered an unusually dry era. That, and with the insufficient understanding of the ecology of the said area, the farmers then conducted extensive deep ploughing of the Great Plains virgin topsoil from during the previous decade. This then displaced the native deep-rooted grasses that normally trap both the soil and the moisture within the land, even during periods of drought and high winds. The rapid mechanisation of farm equipment, especially small gasoline tractors, and the widespread use of the combine harvester added to the farmers' decisions to then convert most of the arid grassland, much of which received no more than 10 inches of rain per year, into new cultivated cropland. Because of both the drought and the farming practices at the time, meaning the insufficient understanding of the ecology of the area, it meant that the dried topsoil over time became friable and started crumbling away. This then reduced the topsoil into a powdery consistency, and without any indigenous grasses in place, mainly because they'd all been ploughed up, the plains' high winds then picked up the crumbling topsoil and created massive dust storms. The persistent dry weather also caused the crops to fail, leaving the ploughed fields further exposed to the wind erosion. Then the Great Plains fine soil, which is now dust due to the heat, was then carried east by strong continental winds, and throughout the drought of the 1930s, with the unanchored soil now turned to dust, the prevailing winds that blew away in huge dark clouds, on occasion, started to blacken the sky with these choking billows of dust that earned the nicknames of black blizzards or black rollers, then travelling across the country, reaching as far as the east coast, striking such cities as New York and even Washington, D.C. And on the Great Plains themselves, these black clouds often reduce visibility down to 3 feet or less. And if you think that was bad, let me give you a better idea of how bad things got throughout the next decade. During the whole of the 1930s, the northern Great Plains suffered 4 of their 7 driest calendar years since 1895, and Kansas suffered 4 of its 12 driest, with the entire region south of West Texas lacking any period of above normal rainfall. On the 11th of November 1933, the dust storm stripped all the topsoil from the already desecrated South Dakota farmlands in what was classed as one of the most severe dust storms that year. And at the beginning of May in 1934, on the 9th to be precise, a strong 2-day dust storm removed massive amounts of Great Plains topsoil in another one of its worst storms throughout the whole event, with this particular dust storms blowing all the way to Chicago, where they then deposited around 5,400 tonnes of dust. And then, 2 days later, the very same dust storm reached the cities to the east, which, such as Cleveland, Buffalo, Boston, New York City and Washington DC, and deposited more dust by the tonload there, with monuments like the Statue of Liberty being blotted out, meaning it had simply vanished from view due to the flying debris. There was no escape from this black dust anomaly, as it had even worked its way into the most sealed-off homes, leaving a grey to dark grey coating on nearly all of the food, furniture, clothing, and even on people's skin. Things got so bad in the winters of New England that when the snow fell in the years of 1934 and 1935, the colour of the snow was red. The Associated Press reporter, a man named Robert E. Geiger, who just so happened to be in Boise City, Oklahoma in 1935 to witness what would later be nicknamed Black Sunday, and the editor of the Associated Press at Kansas City News, a Mr. Edward Stanley, while editing Robert Geiger's news story about the weather phenomena, he conceived the term for the event, which is now a very prevalent name, the Dust Bowl. On a quick interesting side note here, Black Sunday was a name given to the 14th of April 1935 after a particularly dark day for the dust storm event. On the afternoon of that day, residents of several plains states were forced to take cover as the dust storm itself blew through the region. The Dust Bowl on Black Sunday first hit the Oklahoma Panhandle, which included the constituent counties of Cimarron, Texas and Beaver, and then struck northwestern Oklahoma before then moving south for the day. The conditions on Black Sunday were the most severe in Oklahoma and the Texas area, but the storm's effects, including drought, erosion and bare soil, were also felt in the surrounding places, with winds causing the dust to fly freely and at high speeds, with witnesses claiming that the storms on that day appeared to turn day into night. Much of the Great Plains farmland was eroded in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl, which, of course, only intensified the economic impact of the Great Depression. On another short but interesting side note, the Great Depression was a period of severe global economic downturn that occurred during and including the years of 1929 to 1939. It was characterised by high rates of unemployment and poverty, drastic reductions in industrial production and trade, and widespread bank and business failures that all happened around the world at the same time. The economic contagion began in the October of 1929 in the United States, which was the largest economy in the world at the time, with the devastating Wall Street stock market crash, which is often considered how the beginning of the Great Depression began. The term the Great Depression is most frequently attributed to the British economist Lionel Robbins, whose book, which was published in 1934 called The Great Depression, is credited with formalising the phrase. After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at the economic aftermath of the drought and storm and how the government tried to recover and rebuild the Great Plains area.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
By 1935, 4 years into the drought, the Dust Bowl had forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families, who by now were unable to pay their mortgages or grow any crops, to abandon their farms and travel to other areas of the country to find work. With this abandonment of homesteads and financial ruin resulting from the catastrophic topsoil loss, which then led to widespread hunger and poverty. More than 500,000 Americans were left homeless, with more than 350 houses having to be torn down after just one storm alone. Others either had their mortgages foreclosed by the banks or felt that they had no choice other than to abandon their farms, with some packing up various vehicles along with a few personal belongings with their families in tow and migrated to the west in search for work. Many of these families from Oklahoma earned the nickname of Okies, mainly because of where they came from before they migrated. The total financial loss due to both the droughts and the storm by 1936 had reached up to $25 million a day, which was the equivalent of $550 million per day in 2023. However, unfortunately, some residents of the Great Plains, especially in Kansas and Oklahoma, fell ill with coughing spasms or silicosis from breathing, with some people even dying from either dust pneumonia or malnutrition. The overall total of people who left the Dust Bowl state back in the 1930s was roughly 3.5 million, although some sites do say as little as 2.5 million, but either way, it was one of the largest ever migrations in American history. In 1935, the President's Drought Committee issued a report covering the government's assistance to agriculture during 1934 due to mid-1935. The report discussed the conditions, measures of relief, organisation, finances, operations, and the results of the government's assistance. By the end of the 1930s, in many regions of the Great Plains, more than 75% of the topsoil had blown away, leaving various types of total land degradation. And aside from the short-term economic consequences of the land erosion, the Dust Bowl had severe long-term economic consequences in the area. By 1940, the counties that had experienced the most erosion from the dust storms and droughts from the previous decade had a greater decline in agricultural land values, with the per-acre value of farmland declining by 28% in high erosion counties and 17% in medium erosion counties. And over the long-term period, the land's agricultural value often failed to return to pre-Dust Bowl levels. The economic effects persisted, mainly in part because of the farmers' failure to switch to more appropriate crops for highly eroded areas. And not only that, but farmers found it more productive to shift from crops and wheat to animals and hay. It has been said that some of the failures to shift to more productive agricultural products may be related to the ignorance about the benefits of changing the use of the land. A second explanation has been put down to the poor availability of any credit, which was caused by the high rate of failure of the banks in the Great Plains area or states. And because the banks failed in the Dust Bowl region at a higher rate than anywhere else, farmers could not get the credit they needed to obtain capital to shift crop production. And in addition to that, the profit margins in either animal or hay was still minimal, so farmers at first had little to no incentive to change their crops. In 1937, a few years into the drought, the federal government began an aggressive campaign to encourage Dust Bowl farmers to adopt a planting and ploughing method that would conserve the soil. The government paid the reluctant farmers $1 an acre, which is the equivalent to $21 an acre in 2023. In order to help and encourage them to use these new farming methods. And by 1938, the massive conservation effort had reduced the amount of blowing dust and soil by 65%. The only problem was that the land itself still failed to yield a decent living. However, the government didn't let this detail dissuade their plight and continued with the use of these conservation methods in order to protect the plains, soil and ecology of the area and greatly expand its participation in the land management and soil conservation that had resulted from the disaster. In order to help identify the areas that needed the most attention, groups such as the Soil Conservation Service generated detailed soil maps and took photographs of the land from the sky. And to create shelter belts to reduce soil erosion, groups such as the United States Forest Service's Prairie States Forestry Project, that's a mouthful I can tell you, started to plant more trees on private lands, with President Roosevelt ordering the Civilian Conservation Corps to plant the to plant the Great Plains shelter belt with a huge number of more than 200 million trees stretching from Canada to Abilene, Texas, in order to break the wind, hold the water in the soil, and hold the soil in place. On an interesting side note, a shelter belt or windbreak is a mass planting usually made up of one or more rows of trees or shrubs planted in such a manner as to provide shelter from the wind, protect soil from erosion, and help keep any snow from drifting onto the roadways or yards. Shelter belts are commonly planted in the hedgerows around the edge of the fields in farms. Other benefits of shelter belts include the contribution to a microclimate around crops, with slightly less drying and chilling at night, providing a habitat for wildlife and, in some regions, providing wood if the trees are later harvested. Other groups, like the Resettlement Administration, which later became the Farm Security Administration, encouraged small farm owners to resettle on other lands if they lived in drier parts of the Great Plains. The administration then also began to educate farmers on soil conservation and anti-erosion techniques, which included things like crop rotation, strip farming, contour ploughing and terracing. All in all, many different groups took to many different approaches in responding to the 1930s Dust Bowl disaster. And then, finally, in the fall of 1939, after nearly a decade of dirt and dust, the drought ended, when the clouds finally erupted and brought forth much needed rain and water to the area. The 1930s Dust Bowl crisis was documented by photographers, musicians and authors, with many of them being hired during the Great Depression by federal government. For example, the Farm Administration hired photographers to document the incident, and artists such as Dorothea Lang were aided by having salaried work during the Great Depression, with her capturing what have become classic images of the 1930s dust storms and their migrant families. And the author, John Steinbeck, borrowing closely from field notes taken by Farm Security Administration worker and author Sonora Babb, wrote a book called The Grapes of Wrath that was published in 1939 about the migrant workers and the farm families that were displaced by the Dust Bowl. On a short but interesting side note here, Sonora Babb's own novel about the lives of the migrant workers, whose names are unfortunately unknown, was written in 1939 but was eclipsed and shelved in response to John Steinbeck's success, and so was not published until 2004. Folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote many songs about the dark days of the 1930s, with a multitude of those tracks included on his 1940 album that was simply called Dust Bowl Ballads. The songs are mainly about his experiences in the Dust Bowl era during the Great Depression and what he had learnt from the displaced farmers while he was travelling with them on their commute from Oklahoma to California. This earned Woody Guthrie the nickname of the Dust Bowl Troubadour.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 125, we are going to be looking at Jean Wiley, the feral child. Jean Wiley is the pseudonym of an American feral child who was a victim of severe abuse, neglect and social isolation. Her circumstances are prominently recorded in the Annals of Linguistics and Abnormal Child Psychology. When she was approximately 20 months old, her father began keeping her in a locked room. During this period, he almost always strapped her to a child's toilet or bound her in a crib with her arms and legs immobilised, forbade anyone to interact with her, provided her with almost no stimulation of any kind, and left her severely malnourished. Her abuse came to the attention of Los Angeles County Child Welfare Authorities in the November of 1970, when she was just 13 years old and 7 months, after which she became a ward of the state of California.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations, of course, were all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I will see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea at the end, credits as a podcast as a thank you, if if I'm allowed to, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. A thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.